1 year after the reunion at Fort Davidson, Sarah received a phone call that would once again change her life in ways she never could have anticipated. The documentary filmmaker who had recorded the reunion weekend was calling to inform her that the film, titled Letters from the Heart, Building Bridges Between Soldiers and Civilians, had been accepted for screening at the Sundance Film Festival and was being considered for national television broadcast. The documentary had followed several of the pen-pal relationships that emerged from Sarah's original visit, capturing the profound impact these connections had on both soldiers and civilians. Viewers would see Jackson's ongoing relationship with his grandmother Eleanor, Thompson's mother leading her support network for military families dealing medical crises, and Wilson's mentorship with the first day of the reunion dawned crisp and clear at Fort Davidson, with buses beginning to arrive before sunrise. Sarah stood at the main gate, wearing her best dress and the American flag pin that Private Jackson had given her months earlier, watching as hundreds of civilians stepped onto the military base for what would become one of the most extraordinary weekends in military community relations history. Eleanor was among the first to arrive, stepping carefully off the bus from Ohio with the assistance of her soldier grandson Jackson, who had been granted special permission to greet the civilian guests as they arrived. The reunion of grandmother and grandson, after months of phone calls and letters, was the first of many emotional moments that would define the weekend. Eleanor's hands shook as she embraced Jackson, both of them crying openly as other arriving guests witnessed their joy. The sight of this elderly woman and young soldier embracing set the tone for everything that followed. Other soldiers began appearing at the gate to meet their pen pals, creating a series of first meetings that were both heartwarming and profound. These were people who knew each other's deepest fears, greatest hopes, and most personal stories, but who had never seen each other's faces or heard each other's voices in person. Thompson appeared with his mother, who had traveled from Colorado despite ongoing cancer treatment because she refused to miss the chance to meet the soldiers who had supported her family through their darkest months. Her arrival sparked an impromptu gathering of soldiers who had written to her, each wanting to express personally their gratitude for her son's service and their admiration for her strength during her illness. Wilson met his elderly veteran mentor for the first time, and their connection was immediate and powerful. The older man, who had served in Vietnam and struggled with his own post-service adjustment, had found new purpose in guiding younger soldiers through his correspondence with Wilson. Their face-to-face meeting represented a bridge between different generations of military service that honored both their shared experiences and their unique challenges. The reunion's formal activities began with a ceremony that no one in attendance would ever forget. Colonel Morrison addressed the gathering of over 300 civilians and 40 soldiers, describing how their correspondence network had created measurable improvements in soldier morale, civilian community engagement, and military-civilian understanding. He announced that Fort Davidson would be designated as the pilot site for a new Army program called Community Bridges, which would be implemented at bases nationwide based on the success of their informal letter-writing network. Sarah was called forward to receive a special recognition that the soldiers had arranged through military channels. The presentation of a Civilian Service Award, normally reserved for individuals who had provided extraordinary support to military operations, acknowledged her role in creating a program that was now being studied as a model for civilian-military relations across all branches of the armed forces. As Sarah accepted the award, she spoke briefly about her gratitude for the soldiers who had welcomed her simple gesture and transformed it into something beyond her wildest imagination. Her words were interrupted frequently by applause from both the civilian guests and the soldiers, who stood together in the Fort Davidson Gymnasium in a display of unity that moved many participants to tears. The weekend included tours of military facilities, shared meals in the base dining hall, and informal gatherings where new pen-pal relationships were formed on the spot. Children from military families met elderly civilians who immediately adopted them as surrogate grandparents. Military spouses connected with civilian support networks that extended far beyond their base communities. High school students participating in the reunion established mentorship relationships with soldiers that would guide their own future career decisions. One of the most remarkable developments of the weekend was the emergence of what participants began calling story circles. These informal gatherings allowed soldiers and civilians to share experiences, fears, hopes, and dreams in small groups that created intimate connections between people from vastly different backgrounds. A soldier's story about missing his daughter's birthday might be followed by an elderly woman's account of celebrating birthdays alone since her husband's death, leading to immediate understanding and ongoing support between individuals who had just met. Rodriguez, whose deployment had been delayed, used the reunion to announce that he would be creating a formal nonprofit organization to expand the civilian-military pen pal program nationally. His proposal included establishing regional coordinators, creating standardized letter-writing protocols, and developing educational materials about military life for civilian participants and civilian culture for military personnel. Several reunion attendees immediately volunteered to serve as founding board members for the organization. The reunion's second day featured breakout sessions where different groups planned ongoing activities and expansions of the program. The Ohio delegation organized a committee to establish pen pal programs at military bases throughout the Midwest. The church groups developed plans for creating military family support networks in their home communities. The veterans in attendance established a mentorship program that would connect retired military personnel with active duty soldiers dealing with service-related challenges. Thompson's mother announced that she would be starting a support network specifically for families dealing with medical crises while a family member was deployed. Her personal experience with cancer treatment while her son was stationed far from home had shown her how crucial civilian support networks could be for military families facing health emergencies. Her announcement was met with immediate offers of assistance from medical professionals, social workers, and other military families in attendance. The reunion's most unexpected development came when a military documentary filmmaker, who had received permission to record portions of the event, announced that her footage would be used to create a full-length documentary about the civilian military bridge program. The film would follow several of the pen pal relationships that had developed from Sarah's original visit, documenting how individual acts of kindness could create lasting social change. Several reunion participants agreed to be followed by cameras as their relationships continued to develop over the coming months. Sarah found herself at the center of media attention that felt overwhelming, but also deeply meaningful. Television interviews, newspaper articles, and radio appearances gave her opportunities to explain how the simple act of reaching out to strangers had created a network of support and friendship that was improving lives across multiple states. Her message consistently emphasized that extraordinary results could come from ordinary people who chose to connect with others rather than remain isolated. The reunion's final day featured a ceremony that would become the template for similar events at military bases nationwide. Each civilian participant received a certificate recognizing their contribution to military community relations, while each soldier received a special commendation for their role in building bridges between military and civilian communities. The certificates were signed by base commanders, civilian dignitaries, and organizational representatives, creating official recognition of the informal relationships that had grown from Sarah's original letter. As the reunion concluded and buses prepared to depart, the participants realized that they were leaving with much more than memories of a special weekend. They had created a permanent network of relationships, support systems, and communication channels that would continue to grow and develop long after they returned to their home communities. Phone numbers, addresses, and email contacts were exchanged in abundance, ensuring that the connections formed during the reunion would continue to flourish. Eleanor's departure was particularly emotional, as she said goodbye not only to her grandson Jackson but also to dozens of soldiers who had become extended family members through their correspondence and personal interactions during the reunion. Her promise to continue coordinating civilian support efforts in Ohio was echoed by similar commitments from participants in every state represented at the gathering. The reunion generated immediate requests from other military installations for assistance in establishing their own civilian military bridge programs. Within weeks of the event's conclusion, Fort Davidson was hosting visits from military community relations specialists, civilian volunteer coordinators, and government officials interested in expanding the program on a national scale. For Sarah, returning to her quiet house in Cedar Falls after the reunion felt like coming down from a mountain peak where the view had been breathtaking but almost too vast to comprehend. The magnitude of what had grown from her simple gesture continued to amaze her. But, more importantly, it had given her a sense of purpose and connection that had transformed her own life as dramatically as it had influenced the lives of the soldiers and civilians she had brought together. The reunion had demonstrated conclusively that the hunger for genuine human connection existed on both sides of the civilian-military divide, and that meeting this need could create benefits that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Communities were stronger, families were more supported, soldiers were more connected to the civilians they served, and civilians had deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made by military families. But even as participants celebrated the success of their reunion and planned for future expansions of the program, none of them realized that their story was about to take another unexpected turn that would bring their message of connection and kindness to an audience larger than any of them had ever imagined possible. 6 months after Sarah's first visit to Fort Davidson, the soldiers of Alpha Company had developed what they secretly called Operation Gratitude. It started as informal conversations during their evening downtime, where they shared stories about the letters they were receiving from civilians and the impact these connections were having on their morale and sense of purpose. Private Jackson, now promoted to specialist, had become the unofficial leader of this growing movement. His weekly phone calls with his grandmother Eleanor had evolved into three-way conversations that included other soldiers and their civilian pen pals. What began as simple check-ins had transformed into deep discussions about life, service, family, and the bridges being built between military and civilian communities. The soldiers had been keeping detailed records of all the connections that had sprouted from Sarah's original visit. They discovered that 40 soldiers were now corresponding with over 200 civilians across 12 states. The network included grandparents, single mothers, elderly veterans, high school students working on military appreciation projects, and entire church congregations that had adopted soldiers as extended family members. Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted and was preparing for deployment overseas, but before leaving, he wanted to create something permanent to honor the civilian support network that had given him and his fellow soldiers so much strength. During a late-night conversation in the barracks, he proposed an idea that would require careful planning, military approval, and coordination across multiple states. The soldiers wanted to organize a reunion that would bring together all the civilians who had become part of their extended military family. Not just a simple gathering, but a 3-day event that would celebrate the connections that had formed and create new ones that could last for decades. They envisioned bringing Sarah, Eleanor, the cancer-fighting mother from Thompson's hometown, the church groups, the elderly pen pals, and dozens of other civilians to Fort Davidson for an unprecedented celebration of civilian-military unity. Getting approval for such an event required navigating military bureaucracy, securing funding, and convincing commanding officers that this unconventional gathering would benefit both the military and the broader community. The soldiers worked for months on their proposal, documenting the measurable improvements in morale, retention rates, and community relations that had resulted from the civilian outreach program. Their commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, was initially skeptical. Military bases were designed for training and operations, not for hosting large civilian gatherings. However, as he reviewed the soldiers' documentation and witnessed firsthand the positive changes in his unit's attitude and performance, he began to see the potential value of their proposal. The breakthrough came when Colonel Morrison received a letter from Eleanor, Jackson's grandmother, written on behalf of all the civilian pen pals. In her elegant handwriting, she described how the soldier correspondence program had not only supported military families but had also revitalized entire civilian communities. Elderly residents who had been isolated were now actively engaged in meaningful relationships. Families dealing with military deployment stress had found support networks they never knew existed. Young people were developing respect and appreciation for military service through personal connections rather than abstract patriotic concepts. Eleanor's letter included testimonials from dozens of civilians whose lives had been changed by their relationships with soldiers. A widow in Montana wrote about how letters from her soldier pen pal had helped her through her first Christmas alone. A teenager in Florida described how corresponding with a deployed soldier had inspired him to pursue military service himself. A church group in Tennessee had raised over $10,000 for military family support programs after developing personal relationships with soldiers through the letter exchange. Convinced by the evidence and moved by the testimonials, Colonel Morrison approved the reunion event, officially designated as the first annual civilian military bridge building conference. The military would provide the venue and basic support, while the soldiers organized fundraising efforts to help cover travel expenses for their civilian guests. The fundraising campaign became a story in itself. The soldiers organized car washes, bake sales, and community service projects to raise money for their reunion. Local businesses, inspired by the soldiers' dedication to honoring their civilian supporters, began contributing funds and services. The newspaper articles about their efforts attracted attention from veterans organizations and military support groups across the country who offered additional financial assistance. Sarah, meanwhile, had become the unofficial civilian coordinator for the reunion. Her quiet life in Cedar Falls had been transformed as she found herself managing correspondence with hundreds of people, coordinating travel arrangements, and serving as the primary contact point between the military planners and the civilian participants. Her small house became a command center filled with maps, lists, travel itineraries, and care packages being prepared for the soldiers. The reunion planning revealed the true scope of the network that had grown from that single magazine and letter. Families were planning to travel from as far away as Alaska and Florida to attend the event. Eleanor had organized a bus trip for elderly participants from her Ohio apartment complex. Thompson's mother, now in remission from her cancer, was bringing a delegation from her support group. The church congregations had chartered buses and were planning to bring homemade gifts for every soldier in the unit. 3 weeks before the reunion, an unexpected development added even more significance to the event. Rodriguez's deployment had been delayed, allowing him to participate in the reunion he had helped plan. More importantly, his commanding officers had decided to use the reunion as a model for similar programs at other military installations. Representatives from 5 other Army bases would attend the reunion to observe and learn from the civilian-military connection program that had started with Sarah's simple visit. The media attention grew as the reunion date approached. Military publications featured articles about the innovative community outreach program. Local television stations planned to cover the event. A military documentary filmmaker requested permission to record parts of the reunion for a feature about modern civilian-military relations. For Sarah, the attention was both exciting and overwhelming. She had never imagined that her lonely drive to Fort Davidson would lead to national recognition of the importance of civilian-military connections. Interviews with reporters felt surreal, as she tried to explain how a simple thank you letter had sparked a movement that was now being studied as a model for military-community relations across the country. The soldiers were experiencing their own mix of excitement and nervousness as the reunion approached. Many of them would be meeting their pen pals face-to-face for the first time. Jackson would finally embrace his grandmother Eleanor, whom he now spoke with multiple times each week. Wilson would meet the elderly veteran who had become his mentor through their extensive correspondence. Thompson would introduce his mother to the soldiers who had supported his family through her cancer treatment. Behind the scenes, the soldiers were planning surprises for their civilian guests that went beyond the scheduled reunion activities. They had been working with local artisans to create personalized gifts for each civilian participant. They had arranged special tours of military equipment and facilities that were normally off-limits to civilians. Most significantly, they had prepared a formal ceremony to present Sarah with an honorary recognition that had been specially created to acknowledge her role in founding the civilian military bridge program. As the final preparations were completed, everyone involved realized they were about to participate in something unprecedented in military history. Never before had a single civilian's spontaneous act of gratitude led to such an extensive and meaningful connection between military and civilian communities. The reunion would not only celebrate the relationships that had already formed, but would also serve as a launching point for expanding the program to military bases nationwide. The stage was set for 3 days that would demonstrate the profound impact that genuine human connection can have on both individual lives and entire communities. For 40 soldiers and over 300 civilians, the reunion represented the culmination of months of letter writing, phone calls, care packages, and shared experiences that had created bonds stronger than those formed by many families. What no one fully anticipated was that the reunion itself would generate even more unexpected developments, creating new connections and inspiring additional acts of kindness that would continue the ripple effects for years to come. 3 weeks after Sarah's visit to Fort Davidson, Private Jackson sat in his barracks holding a letter from his grandmother in Ohio. The elderly woman's handwriting was shakier than he remembered, and between the lines of her usual updates about her garden and the weather, he could sense something he had never noticed before, the same loneliness that Sarah had described during her visit. Jackson had been thinking about Sarah's story every day since she left the base. Her courage in reaching out to strangers, her willingness to be vulnerable with people she had never met, had planted a seed in his mind that was now beginning to grow into action. After reading his grandmother's letter for the 3rd time, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He picked up his phone and dialed his grandmother's number, something he had done maybe half a dozen times since joining the military. This time, however, the conversation was different. Instead of the usual brief exchange about his health and safety, Jackson asked his grandmother about her day, her feelings, her fears about living alone. For the first time in his adult life, he listened to her not just as his grandmother, but as a person with her own struggles and dreams. What he learned during that hour-long phone call shocked him. His grandmother, Eleanor, had been dealing with depression since his grandfather's death 3 years earlier. She had been too proud to burden her family with her struggles, instead maintaining a cheerful facade in her letters and brief phone calls. She admitted that some days she didn't speak to another human being from morning until night, and that the silence was becoming unbearable. Jackson found himself sharing Sarah's story with his grandmother, describing how one woman's simple act of reaching out had touched 40 soldiers and made them all feel less alone. As he spoke, he could hear something change in Eleanor's voice. By the end of their conversation, both grandmother and grandson were crying, but they were also making plans. Eleanor agreed to write letters to some of Jackson's fellow soldiers, especially those who had mentioned missing their families during Sarah's visit. Jackson promised to call her twice a week, not just to check in, but to really talk. They also decided that Eleanor would reach out to her neighbors, particularly the other widows in her apartment complex, to see if they might want to form a support group. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Eleanor's first letter went to Sergeant Rodriguez, who had spoken about missing his daughter's milestones. In her carefully written note, Eleanor shared stories about Jackson's childhood, the pride she felt watching him grow up, and her understanding of how difficult it must be for Rodriguez to miss precious moments with his own child. Rodriguez was so moved by Eleanor's letter that he wrote back immediately, sharing photos of his daughter and telling Eleanor about his dreams for her future. He also did something that surprised even himself. He called his own grandmother in Texas, whom he hadn't spoken to in months. That phone call led to a reunion that had been postponed too many times, and Rodriguez arranged for emergency leave to visit her before his next deployment. Meanwhile, word about Sarah's visit and its impact was spreading throughout Fort Davidson. Soldiers who hadn't been present that day were hearing the story secondhand and beginning to think about their own connections to the civilian world. The letter that all 40 soldiers had signed for Sarah had been photocopied and posted in the barracks, serving as a daily reminder of the power of reaching out to others. Corporal Thompson, inspired by the growing network of communication, decided to contact Sarah directly. Using the address from the letter she had left behind, he wrote to tell her how her visit had affected him and his fellow soldiers. He also shared something he had never told anyone. His mother was battling cancer, and he felt helpless being so far away from her during her treatment. Sarah's response arrived within a week, and it contained much more than Thompson had expected. Not only had she written a heartfelt letter of support, but She had also reached out to her network of friends in Cedar Falls. Within days, Thompson's mother was receiving visits from local volunteers who brought meals, offered rides to medical appointments, and provided the kind of community support that Thompson had wished he could give her himself. The magazine that had started it all was beginning to take on a life of its own. Sarah had kept the soldiers' notes and addresses, and she began writing to different members of the unit regularly. Each letter she sent sparked new connections, new conversations, and new acts of kindness that rippled outward in directions no one could have predicted. Private Wilson, who had spoken about his fears regarding deployment, received a care package from Sarah that included homemade cookies, books, and letters from several elderly residents of Cedar Falls who wanted to support a soldier they had never met. Wilson was so touched by this gesture that he organized his entire unit to write thank-you letters to the elderly residents, creating pen-pal relationships that would last for years. The impact wasn't limited to the soldiers and their new correspondents. At Fort Davidson, the atmosphere in the barracks had shifted noticeably. Soldiers who had previously kept their personal struggles to themselves were now more open about their challenges and more willing to support each other. The commanding officers noticed the change and began incorporating discussions about community connection and mutual support into their regular training sessions. Back in Cedar Falls, Sarah found herself at the center of a growing network of volunteers who wanted to support military families. The librarian who had always been quiet and reserved was now organizing letter-writing campaigns, coordinating care packages, and connecting elderly residents with soldiers who needed family-like support while serving away from home. Eleanor, Jackson's grandmother, had become the unofficial coordinator of what the group was calling surrogate grandparents for soldiers. Her apartment complex in Ohio now buzzed with activity as elderly residents gathered weekly to write letters, share military news, and support each other through their own challenges. The loneliness that had plagued Eleanor for years was replaced by a sense of purpose and community that energized everyone around her. The local newspaper in Cedar Falls caught wind of the story and ran a feature article about Sarah's visit to Fort Davidson and its unexpected consequences. The article, titled "One Woman's Thank You Changes 40 Lives," was picked up by regional papers and eventually made its way to military publications. Suddenly, Sarah was receiving letters from soldiers at bases across the country, all inspired by her story and hoping to connect with civilians who understood the value of their service. At Fort Davidson, the monthly community outreach days began attracting larger crowds, with many visitors specifically requesting to meet the soldiers who had been part of Sarah's original group. The base commanders, initially puzzled by the increased civilian interest, soon realized they were witnessing something remarkable, a genuine bridge between military and civilian communities that was creating lasting positive change for everyone involved. Rodriguez received news that his grandmother in Texas had started a similar letter-writing program at her church, connecting elderly parishioners with soldiers from the nearby military base. Thompson's mother, now surrounded by a support network in her small town, was responding better to her cancer treatment and had become an advocate for other military families dealing with medical crises. Wilson's pen-pal relationship with an elderly veteran from Cedar Falls had led to a mentorship that was helping him prepare for his leadership responsibilities in the military. As the network continued to grow, Sarah realized that something extraordinary was happening. What had started as her personal need to thank one soldier had become a movement that was touching lives across multiple states. Families were reconnecting. Elderly people were finding new purpose. Soldiers were discovering civilian support they never knew existed, and communities were coming together in ways that seemed to restore faith in human kindness. The magazine that had carried her original letter was now accompanied by a growing collection of correspondence, photos, care packages, and stories that documented the expanding connections. Sarah kept everything in a large wooden box that had belonged to her husband, turning it into a treasure chest of human connection that grew larger every week. But even as Sarah marveled at what was unfolding around her, she had no idea that the most remarkable developments were yet to come. The soldiers, inspired by the connections they had made and the support they were receiving, were beginning to plan something that would take their gratitude to an entirely new level. The ripple effects of kindness were building momentum, and Soon they would create waves that would reach further than anyone had dared to imagine. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Davidson as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her dusty pickup truck, clutching a crumpled copy of Home and Garden magazine against her chest. She had driven 3 hours through winding mountain roads to reach this remote military outpost, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the main gate. The guards looked at her with curious eyes, wondering what business this middle-aged woman from the nearby town of Cedar Falls could possibly have with their soldiers. Sarah was nobody special by most standards. She worked part-time at the local library, tended to her small garden behind a modest 2-bedroom house, and lived quietly since her husband Frank had passed away 2 years earlier. But today was different. Today, she carried with her a story that would change the lives of everyone she was about to meet, though she didn't know it yet. The magazine in her hands contained more than just recipes and decorating tips. Hidden between its pages was a letter she had written 3 weeks ago during one of her sleepless nights, when the silence of her empty house had become too much to bear. In that letter, she had poured out her heart about loneliness, about the struggle of starting over at 55, and about a small act of kindness that had given her hope when she needed it most. It had all started with a simple mistake. Sarah had been at the grocery store, fumbling through her purse for exact change when she realized she was 37 cents short for her modest purchase. Behind her in line stood a young man in military fatigues, probably no older than her own son would have been if he had lived past his 21st birthday. Without hesitation, the soldier had stepped forward and handed the cashier a dollar bill. The gesture itself wasn't extraordinary. People help strangers every day. But for Sarah, who had felt invisible since Frank's death, who had grown accustomed to moving through the world unnoticed and unhelped, this simple act had felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in grief. She had tried to thank the young man, but he had already disappeared into the parking lot, leaving her standing there with tears in her eyes and a renewed faith in human kindness. That night, Sarah had written a thank you letter to the unknown soldier, expressing how much his gesture had meant to her. But she had no way to deliver it. She didn't know his name, his unit, or even if he was still stationed in the area. The letter had sat on her kitchen table for weeks, a tangible reminder of gratitude with nowhere to go. Then, she had seen the newspaper article about Fort Davidson hosting a community outreach day, welcoming local civilians to tour the base and meet the soldiers. Sarah had made her decision in that moment. If she couldn't thank one soldier, perhaps she could thank all of them. She had carefully tucked her letter into the magazine she was reading, thinking it might serve as a conversation starter, and driven to the base. Now, as she walked through the security checkpoint, Sarah felt her courage wavering. The soldiers around her seemed so young, so serious, so different from her quiet world of library books and garden vegetables. She almost turned back twice, but something kept her moving forward, one hesitant step at a time. The base was larger than she had imagined. Concrete buildings stretched across acres of carefully maintained grounds, where soldiers went about their daily routines with purpose and efficiency that both impressed and intimidated her. She followed the small group of other visitors, mostly families of enlisted men, as they were led toward the main recreation area where the community event was taking place. In the recreation center, Sarah found herself surrounded by the energy of 40 young soldiers who had been given a brief break from their training schedule. They stood in small groups, some talking with visiting family members, others playing pool or watching television. The atmosphere was relaxed but respectful, exactly the kind of environment Sarah had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. She spotted a quiet corner where several soldiers were gathered around a table and approached them with the magazine still pressed against her chest. Her heart was beating so fast she was sure they could hear it, but she forced herself to speak. The first soldier she approached was a tall, lanky young man with kind eyes who introduced himself as Private Jackson. When Sarah explained that she had written a letter of thanks to an unknown soldier and wanted to share it with them, his expression shifted from polite interest to genuine curiosity. He called over his friends, and soon Sarah found herself surrounded by 8 or 9 soldiers, all listening intently as she began to tell her story. As she spoke, something remarkable happened. The noise of the recreation center seemed to fade away, and more soldiers began drifting over to listen. Sarah's voice, which had started as barely a whisper, grew stronger as she saw the genuine interest in their faces. She told them about her husband, about her loneliness, about the grocery store encounter that had restored her faith in people. When she pulled out the letter and began to read it aloud, the effect was immediate and profound. These young men, many of whom were far from their own families and struggling with their own fears and uncertainties, heard in Sarah's words something they hadn't expected to find in their military service: the knowledge that their smallest actions mattered to people they would never see again. Private Jackson was the first to respond. He told Sarah about his own grandmother, who lived alone in Ohio, and who he worried about constantly. He shared how hard it was to be away from family, especially during holidays and difficult times. His openness encouraged others to speak up, and soon the group had grown to include nearly half the soldiers in the recreation center. Sergeant Rodriguez spoke about missing his daughter's first steps while deployed overseas. Corporal Thompson shared his struggle with leaving his sick mother to serve his country. Private Wilson admitted his fear about an upcoming deployment to a dangerous region. Each story was met with nods of understanding from the others, creating a bond between these men that went beyond their shared military service. Sarah listened to each story with the same attention and compassion she had hoped to receive, and, in doing so, she gave these soldiers something invaluable: the experience of being truly heard. In her presence, they weren't just soldiers following orders or young men trying to prove their toughness. They were human beings with fears, hopes, dreams, and families they loved. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah realized that something extraordinary was happening. What had begun as her attempt to thank one unknown soldier had become a gathering unlike anything she had ever experienced. The formal barriers between civilian and military, between young and old, between stranger and friend, had dissolved completely. In their place was something pure and powerful: genuine human connection. The magazine that had served as her conversation starter was now being passed from hand to hand, with soldiers writing their own messages in the margins. Some wrote their names and addresses, hoping to stay in touch. Others wrote brief notes of thanks for her visit. A few shared phone numbers of family members who might appreciate a letter from a stranger who understood loneliness. By the time the community event officially ended, Sarah had spent nearly 4 hours at the base. She had shared her lunch with soldiers who reminded her of sons she never had, listened to stories that would stay with her forever, and created connections that would span decades. Most importantly, she had discovered that her own capacity for kindness was far greater than she had ever imagined. As she prepared to leave, the soldiers insisted on walking her to her truck. They had written their own letter to her, signed by all 40 men in the unit, expressing their gratitude for her visit and promising to remember her story. Private Jackson handed her a small American flag pin, telling her that she had shown them what true service to others looked like. Sarah drove home that evening with tears streaming down her face. But, for the first time in 2 years, they were tears of joy rather than grief. She had gone to the base hoping to thank one soldier for his kindness, and had instead discovered a community of remarkable young men who had thanked her for reminding them why their service mattered. What none of them knew as they said their goodbyes was that this was only the beginning. The connections formed that day would soon grow into something none of them could have imagined, touching lives across the country and creating a network of support and friendship that would endure for decades to come. Picture this. A single woman walks into a military base carrying nothing but a worn magazine in her hands. Within hours, 40 hardened soldiers would be transformed forever, their lives taking a turn so unexpected that military officials would struggle to explain what happened next. This isn't a story about war or conflict. It's about something far more powerful than any weapon ever created: the unstoppable force of human connection and how one ordinary moment can create extraordinary ripple effects that change lives across continents. What started as a simple gesture would spiral into an international phenomenon, touching the lives of families thousands of miles apart, creating bonds that would last decades, and proving that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happen. The woman didn't know she was about to become part of military history. The soldiers had no idea their routine day would become the most meaningful experience of their service. And Nobody could have predicted that a single magazine would become the catalyst for a chain of events so remarkable that people still struggle to believe it really happened. This is that story. Every word is true. Every emotion is real. And, by the end, you'll understand why sometimes the most incredible tales aren't found in fiction, but in the extraordinary moments that unfold when ordinary people do something that changes everything.